The dust of the Dakota territory didn't just settle on your skin. It worked its way into your soul, leaving a gritty residue of desperation. For Josephine Bellwether, that desperation tasted like ash in her mouth. Her brother was wasting away with fever, their wagon was a wreck of splintered wood, and their last dollar was a ghost in her pocket. There was one last hope, a prosperous rancher named Mato-Ohan, a Lakota man, who walked in the white man's world, but was not of it. When she found him, a man built of prairie granite and silence, and asked for a job, his answer struck her like lightning on a clear day. "I will give you a home protection and pay, but only if you'll marry me by sunset." The sun was a merciless hammer in the sky, beating down on the cracked earth of the Dakota territory. Josephine Bellwether shielded her eyes, the worn fabric of her sleeve doing little to cut the glare. Every landmark looked the same, a sea of brittle, sun-scorched grass, broken by distant hazy buttes that shimmered like apparitions. Behind her, in the scant shade offered by their broken-down wagon, her younger brother Thomas coughed a dry, rattling sound that tore at her heart with each rasp. They had been stranded for 3 days. The axle had shattered on a rock that seemed to have sprung from the ground with malicious intent. They had set out from St. Louis with such high hopes, chasing the promise of a new life, far from the scandal that had ruined their family name. Their father, a banker named Alistair Bellwether, had been accused of embezzlement, and though he swore his innocence to his dying breath, the stain had clung to them. They were pariahs. The West was supposed to be a cleansing fire, a place where a name meant less than the sweat on a person's brow. Instead, it was an anvil, and Josephine felt it, reshaping her into something brittle and close to breaking. A passing freighter, a grizzled man named Silas, who smelled of chewing tobacco and pity, had told them about the Ohan ranch. "Biggest spread this side of the Black Hills," he'd said, spitting a brown stream near her worn boots. "Run by an Indian. Mato-Ohan. He's Lakota, but he owns the land, clear deed and all. Deals straight, pays fair, but he don't suffer fools." He was her last, most improbable hope. Leaving Thomas with the last of their water, Josephine had walked the 4 miles under that brutal sun, following Silas's crude map. The Ohan Ranch rose from the plains, not like a settler's hopeful shack, but as something that had grown from the land itself. The main house was a long, low structure of dark timber and river stone, solid and unyielding. A corral built with uncanny precision held a dozen powerful-looking horses, and in the distance, cattle moved like a slow brown river across the grasslands. She found him by the corral, not with a rope, but with a horse, a magnificent buckskin with a wild eye. He wasn't breaking it with force, but with a quiet patience that was more commanding than any whip or spur. He moved around the animal in a slow, hypnotic dance, his voice a low murmur she couldn't decipher. He was taller than she'd expected, with broad shoulders and a lean strength that spoke of a life lived in motion. His black hair was tied back with a simple leather thong, and his face was a collection of stark angles and planes that the sun had burnished to the color of rich copper. He wore practical canvas trousers and a simple cotton shirt, but he moved with a grace that seemed out of place in the clumsy world of settlers. He didn't acknowledge her until the buckskin finally lowered its head and allowed him to touch its muzzle. Only then did his dark eyes, sharp and intelligent as a hawk's, settle on her. They held no warmth, only a deep, unnerving stillness. "You're a long way from anywhere," he said. His voice was a low baritone, the words clipped and precise, with only a trace of an accent she couldn't place. Josephine's throat was a desert. "I'm looking for Mato-Ohan." "You found him." He didn't offer his hand. He simply waited. She took a breath, forcing the words past the lump of fear and pride in her throat. My name is Josephine Bellwether. My brother and I. Our wagon is broken down by the Red Bear Creek. He's sick. Our funds are depleted. I'm looking for work. I can cook, I can clean, I can mend. I'm educated. I can keep ledgers, write letters. I'll do anything. I'm a hard worker. The words tumbled out in a desperate rush. Matto listened without a flicker of expression. His gaze swept over her, taking in the fine dust that coated her dress, the desperation in her eyes, the sunburnt patch on her nose. It wasn't a leering look. It was an assessment as cold and practical as a man judging livestock. He looked past her toward the empty horizon, his jaw tight. You're one of Alistair Bellwether's children, he stated. It wasn't a question. The blood drained from Josephine's face. The scandal had followed them. Of course it had. My father's troubles are not my own, she said, her voice shaking slightly. I am simply asking for a job. He was silent for a long moment, the only sounds the nicker of the horse and the sigh of the wind through the grass. She thought he was going to refuse to send her away to perish on the prairie. When he finally spoke again, his eyes met hers with an intensity that pinned her in place. The work I have isn't for a cook or a maid, he said, slowly, deliberately. But I have a position to fill, a permanent one. A flicker of hope, wild and reckless, surged in her chest. I'll take it. Whatever it is. You haven't heard the terms. He took a step closer, and she had to fight the urge to step back. He wasn't threatening, but his presence was overwhelming, a force of nature in human form. I will send my men to fetch your brother and your wagon. I will see he gets medicine from my people. I will give you a home in that house, a roof that doesn't leak, and a hearth that is always warm. You will have protection food and a wage that will make you comfortable. It was more than she could have dreamed of. It was salvation. Thank you, she breathed, tears welling in her eyes. Thank you, Mr. Ohan. What is the job? His face remained a stoic mask, but his eyes held something she couldn't read, a flicker of calculation, of grim necessity. I need a wife. He said the words, dropping like stones into the silence. Josephine stared, her mind refusing to process the statement. I beg your pardon. A wife. He repeated, his voice flat and devoid of any emotion. It is a business arrangement, a contract, and it is the only position I have available. He looked up at the sun, which was beginning its slow descent toward the western horizon. I'll give you everything I promised. He continued, his gaze returning to her, sharp and absolute. Only if you'll marry me by sunset. The world tilted on its axis. The wind seemed to stop, the air growing thick and heavy. Josephine could hear the frantic drumming of her own heart, a wild bird trapped in her ribs. A wife. It was preposterous, an insult of the highest order. It was the kind of indecent proposal whispered about in back alleys, not declared in the open sunlight by a rancher. That's absurd, she stammered, heat flooding her cheeks. Why would you demand such a thing? My reasons are my own. Matto said, his voice unchanging. They are practical, not romantic. This is not a proposal of the heart, Miss Bellwether. It is a contract, a solution to both our problems. You need sanctuary. I need a wife. Specifically, he added, his eyes narrowing slightly, a white wife. The bluntness of it was a slap in the face. A white wife. She was a commodity, a piece to be moved on a chessboard she couldn't see. Her pride, already battered and bruised, reared up. I am not for sale, Mr. Ohan. I am not buying you, he countered, his tone hardening. I am offering you a partnership that will ensure your survival. Look around you, Miss Bellwether. This land doesn't care about your pride. It will bake you in the summer and freeze you in the winter. The fever in your brother won't wait for your dignity to be satisfied. I am offering him medicine and a warm bed. I am offering you a life. Your other option is to walk back to your broken wagon and wait for the end." Every word was true. The thought of Thomas, his breathing growing shallower by the hour, was a physical pain. She saw his pale face, his trusting eyes. She had promised to protect him, to get him to a new life. What was her pride compared to his life? Why me? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Why by sunset? He finally showed a flicker of something, impatience perhaps. He gestured toward a distant line of hills where another smaller ranch was barely visible. That is Jedediah Kane's land. He wants this valley. He has lawyers in Cheyenne and Washington. He uses the law like a club to beat people with. According to their laws, a man like me, a Lakota man, has a tenuous hold on his own land, no matter what the treaties say. But a man like me with a legal American wife, a white wife, his claim becomes ironclad. Kane is making a legal challenge at the land office in Deadwood. The filing is tomorrow at dawn. To counter it, the marriage must be registered today. The circuit judge is passing through the trading post at dusk. It is my only move. It was a cold, hard calculation of law and land and race. She was a shield, a legal loophole he could wear on his arm. It was deeply, profoundly insulting. And it was also, she had to admit, a brilliant, ruthless strategy. She thought of the men in St. Louis with their soft hands and their predatory smiles, who had offered her protection after her father's fall. They had wanted to own her body and soul. Matto Ohan, for all his shocking directness, was offering her a contract. He wasn't speaking of love or affection. He was speaking of survival. He was treating her like an equal in a desperate negotiation. "What would be expected of me?" she asked, her voice low and steady now. The shock was receding, replaced by a grim pragmatism that was forged in the fire of her recent hardships. "You would live in my house. You would carry my name. You would be seen in town on my arm. In public, you would be my wife. In private," he said, and his gaze was unwavering, "we would be strangers under the same roof. This is not about the marriage bed. This is about the law. You will have your own room. Your brother will have his own. You will not be touched." The final assurance, delivered with the same flat finality as the rest, was what settled it. He was not a lecher. He was a general fighting a war she didn't understand. She looked at her hands, raw and chapped from work they were never meant to do. She thought of Thomas dying in the dirt. She looked at Matto Ohan, a man of the very land that was trying to kill her, offering her a way to conquer it. "There will be a document," she said, her voice finding a surprising strength. "A written contract, outlining the terms, that I am a wife in name only, that a portion of the wage you mentioned is set aside for my brother and myself in an account in my name, and that if this arrangement is dissolved, I leave with that money and safe passage to the nearest city." For the first time, a flicker of something like respect entered his eyes. He nodded slowly. "That is acceptable. I will have it drawn up." "Then you have your wife, Mr. Ohan," Josephine said, lifting her chin. The words felt like stones in her mouth, but she said them. "But I will not be Mrs. Ohan. If I am to be a partner in this contract, you will call me by my name, Josephine." "As you wish, Josephine," he replied, a hint of a wry smile touching his lips for a fraction of a second before vanishing. "My name is Matto?" He turned and shouted a string of words in a language she didn't know. Two Lakota men emerged from a nearby bunkhouse. They were younger than Mato, with the same lean strength. He spoke to them, his voice authoritative, gesturing back the way she had come. They nodded and moved toward the stables with an efficient, purposeful stride. "They will bring your brother and your belongings," Mato said, turning back to her. "His name is Setan. The other is Nagi. They are good men. Thomas will be cared for." He looked at the sun, a fiery orange ball now bleeding into the horizon. "We have a judge to meet." The wedding was a surreal affair. Judge Harlan Finch was a portly man with a whiskey-sweated brow and a stained coat, holding court in the back room of the dusty trading post. He reeked of cheap liquor and impatience, barely glancing up from the marriage certificate as he mumbled the words. The only witnesses were the trading post owner, a wiry man named Peterson, and Mato's man, Setan, who stood by the door like a silent bronze statue, his expression unreadable. Josephine stood beside Mato, her hand trembling slightly. He felt like a furnace next to her, a solid wall of heat and coiled energy. When the judge grunted, "You may kiss the bride." A tense silence fell. Mato simply took her hand, his grip firm and dry, and gave it a brief, formal squeeze. It was a seal on a contract, nothing more. The judge pocketing the fee, Mato slid across the table, didn't seem to notice or care. The ride back to the ranch was silent. The sun had set, plunging the prairie into a world of deep violets and inky blues. The stars emerged, scattered across the vast dark canvas, with a brilliance she had never seen in the gas-lit skies of St. Louis. It was beautiful and terrifying. She was married to a stranger, heading to a home that wasn't hers, in a world that felt as alien as the moon. The house was larger inside than it appeared. The main room was dominated by a massive stone fireplace, the mantel a single polished log of dark wood. The furniture was simple, sturdy and well-made, a long dining table, comfortable-looking leather chairs. There were no fussy curtains or delicate decorations she was used to. Instead, the walls were adorned with intricately beaded Lakota crafts and beautifully painted hides depicting scenes of hunts and horses. It was a man's home, but more than that, it was a Lakota home. She was the intruder here. Thomas was already there, installed in a small, clean room with a comfortable bed. He was sleeping, his breathing still shallow, but more peaceful. An older Lakota woman with a face like a beautiful wrinkled map sat by his bed, humming a low, quiet song and placing a cool, damp cloth on his forehead. "This is Winyan," Mato said from behind her. "She is a healer. She will watch over him." Josephine wanted to rush to her brother's side, but she felt rooted to the spot, an unwelcome guest. The woman Winyan looked up at her, her dark eyes holding a deep, ancient wisdom. She offered a small, hesitant smile. It was the first sign of warmth Josephine had received all day. Mato then led her to another room. "This will be yours?" It was Spartan, but clean, with a simple wooden bed frame, a washstand, and a small wardrobe. A window looked out over the vast, dark prairie. It was a room for a guest or a servant. It was not a bride's chamber. She felt a strange mixture of relief and a hollow ache she couldn't name. "The ledgers are in the study," he said, pausing at the door. "You can begin in the morning. Winyan will bring you food. Good night, Josephine." He left, closing the door softly behind him, and she was alone. She sank onto the edge of the bed, the coarse blanket rough beneath her fingers. She was Josephine O'Hon. The name felt foreign, a costume she was forced to wear. She had saved her brother, but she had sold herself, her name, her future, for the price of that safety. She didn't weep. The tears were frozen somewhere deep inside her, locked away with her fear. The next morning, the reality of her new life began. Matto was already gone when she awoke, out on the range before sunrise. She found the study a small practical room, lined with books on animal husbandry and engineering, sitting incongruously beside texts in a language she didn't recognize. The ledgers were immaculate, every transaction recorded in a neat, precise hand. Matto was not just a rancher. He was a shrewd businessman. Her job was to continue his meticulous work recording sales of cattle purchases, of feed and wages for the half-dozen Lakota hands who worked the ranch. They treated her with a polite, impenetrable distance. They would nod when she passed, their eyes guarded. She was the white woman their boss had inexplicably married. She was an outsider, a ghost in their home. The first true test came 2 days later. A rider approached the ranch, not with the easy loping gait of the Lakota hands, but with an arrogant swagger that was visible even from a distance. As he drew closer, she saw he was a large, florid man, with pale, watchful eyes and a cruel set to his mouth. He rode a fine black stallion and wore a tailored coat that was out of place in this rugged land. Matto met him in the yard, standing with his feet planted, his posture radiating a quiet, immovable strength. Josephine watched from the porch, her heart pounding. "Matto," the man said, his voice a rich baritone that dripped with condescension. "I heard some peculiar news from the trading post. Came to see if it was true. If you're here, Kane, you already know it's true." Matto replied, his voice level. "So this was Jedediah Kane, the enemy." He looked from Matto to Josephine on the porch, and a slow, unpleasant smile spread across his face. "Well, I'll be," Kane drawled, tipping his hat in a mocking gesture. The savage found himself a little white dove. "You must have been mighty desperate, little lady, to tie yourself to this." He let the word hang in the air, thick with unspoken venom. "What did he offer you? A string of beads? A new blanket?" Josephine felt a hot surge of anger. Whatever her arrangement with Matto, it was hers. She would not be mocked by this odious man. She walked down the porch steps and stood beside Matto, lifting her chin. It was a performance, but she would play her part. "Mr. Kane," she said, her voice clear and cold, "my husband and I are quite busy. If you have business here, I suggest you state it. Otherwise you are trespassing." Kane's smile faltered for a second, his eyes narrowing as he took in her defiant stance. Matto glanced at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "Husband," Kane repeated, savoring the word like a sour candy. "A piece of paper from a drunk judge doesn't make a marriage, and it won't save this land for you, Matto. This valley belongs to men who know how to build, not squatters. I'll see you ruined." "You've been trying for 5 years, Kane," Matto said, his voice dangerously soft. "The land is still mine. My wife is here. The law is satisfied. Now get off my property." Kane's face purpled with rage. He spat on the ground near Josephine's feet. "Enjoy your sham marriage while it lasts," he snarled before wheeling his horse around and galloping away, kicking up a cloud of dust that settled over them like a shroud. The air crackled with tension. The performance was over. Josephine felt herself trembling, a delayed reaction to the confrontation. "You did well," Matto said quietly, not looking at her. He needed to see a united front. "He's a vile man," she whispered. "He's a patient one," Matto corrected. "He won't stop." He turned and walked toward the barn, leaving her standing alone in the yard. She had played her part. She had stood by her husband. But the cold knot of fear in her stomach told her that Jedediah Kane was not a man to be trifled with, and that their sunset contract had just bought them a war-not peace. Weeks bled into a month. A routine, fragile as a spider's web, began to form. Josephine managed the ledgers with an efficiency that surprised even herself. She tracked every penny, every head of cattle, every bag of flour. It was a language she understood, a world of numbers and facts that was a welcome refuge from the unsettling, emotional landscape of her new life. Thomas was slowly recovering. Winyan's traditional remedies, brews of willow bark and yarrow poultices of sage, seemed to work where the expensive St. Louis doctor's tonics had failed. He was still thin, but the fever was gone, and color was returning to his cheeks. He adored Winyan, and was picking up snippets of the Lakota language from the ranch hands who had softened toward the boy, if not toward his sister. Mato remained an enigma. He was a phantom in his own house, rising before dawn, and returning after dusk smelling of horse and dust and sweat. They shared meals in a thick, uncomfortable silence, broken only by necessary questions about ranch business. He was polite, remote, and utterly inaccessible. Yet she saw glimpses of the man beneath the stone facade. She saw the gentleness with which he treated his horses, the respect his men held for him, the quiet way he would listen to Thomas's excited chatter about a horned lizard or a circling hawk. The wall between them was his past. She knew nothing of it, except that it held a deep and profound sorrow. The evidence was in a small, locked cherry-wood box on the mantelpiece. One evening, driven by a loneliness so profound it was a physical ache, she found the key in the back of the study desk drawer, where he kept the spare keys for the ranch. Her hands shook as she opened the box. Inside there was no treasure, no gold or jewels. There was a single eagle feather, a lock of jet-black hair, tied with a strip of colored sinew, and a small, worn photograph. It was a portrait of Mato younger, and smiling his arm around a beautiful Lakota woman. Her face was full of light and laughter, her eyes sparkling with joy. On the back of the photo, a single word was written in a delicate hand, Anpetu. The name was like a key, turning a lock in her own heart. This was his wife, his real wife, the woman he had loved. Anpetu. The name meant daybreak. Josephine closed the box, a wave of shame and something akin to grief washing over her. She was a placeholder, a legal necessity occupying the space a great love had left vacant. His coldness wasn't for her. It was a fortress built around a wound that had never healed. Her new knowledge colored everything. She began to see the ranch not as Mato's fortress, but as Anpetu's home. The intricate beadwork, the painted hides, had her hands made them. The small patch of hardy wildflowers near the porch had she planted them. A trip to the trading post for supplies a week later provided more pieces of the puzzle. Beatrice Miller, the owner's daughter, a woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper tongue, cornered her by the bolt of calico. "Quite the stir you've caused, Mrs. O'Han," Beatrice said, her voice a saccharine purr. "Marrying him like that. So sudden." "It was a private matter," Josephine replied stiffly, not wanting to engage in gossip. "Of course," Beatrice smiled a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It's just that no one thought he'd ever marry again. Not after Anpetu. Such a tragedy." She leaned in conspiratorially. She was a beauty, kind as a summer day. Everyone loved her. Her horse threw her down by the creek. A terrible accident. Happened a year ago, last spring. Josephine felt a chill despite the stuffy heat of the store. "Jedediah Kane was sweet on her, you know," Beatrice continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Before she married Mato. He couldn't stand that she chose a redskin over him. Caused a terrible scene right here in this store. Kane's not a man who forgets a slight. Funny thing, that accident. Her horse was the calmest mare you'd ever seen. Knew that trail like the back of its own hoof." The insinuation was clear and ugly. An accident that wasn't an accident. A motive born of jealousy and racial hatred. It cast Jedediah Kane's threats in a new, more sinister light. He didn't just want Matto's land. He wanted to destroy him utterly, to take everything from him, just as he might have taken Anpetu. That night, Josephine couldn't sleep. The pieces were slotting together into a picture of grief obsession and potential murder. Matto's fight with Kane wasn't just about cattle and deeds. It was a silent, simmering war over a dead woman. His proposal to her, his desperate need for a white wife to secure his land, was not just a legal strategy. It was a way to protect the last thing he had left, of Anpetu, the home they had built together. She finally understood. His distance wasn't a rejection of her, but a testament to his loyalty to a memory. He wasn't just a stoic rancher. He was a grieving widower, locked in a deadly battle with the man who may have murdered his wife. And she, Josephine Bellwether, the disgraced banker's daughter, was now standing right in the middle of it. She had signed a contract for her own survival, only to find she had enlisted in a war she was not prepared to fight. The prairie winds rattling the window pane sounded like a woman's mournful whisper, and for the first time, Josephine felt a tremor of genuine fear. Jedediah Kane's campaign of harassment escalated from veiled threats to open aggression. A section of fence was cut one night, and 30 head of prime cattle were driven off. A week later, one of the northern wells was found, fouled with a dead coyote poisoning the water for 100 acres of pasture land. Matto and his men worked tirelessly, their faces grim, their silences deeper than ever. Matto himself seemed to be carved from stone, his exhaustion showing only in the tighter set of his jaw and the shadows beneath his eyes. Josephine felt a frustrating sense of helplessness. She managed the ledgers documenting the financial losses with a cold, clear precision that felt utterly inadequate. She was a part of this fight, yet she was confined to paper and ink while the real battle was fought on the open range. It was during one of her meticulous reviews of the supply accounts that she first noticed the anomaly. It was small, almost insignificant. A receipt for 3 spools of high-tensile barbed wire from Peterson's trading post signed for by a ranch hand named Pete Gallagher. The date was from 2 weeks prior. She remembered the purchase. They had needed it to repair a fence line near the bluffs. But when she cross-referenced it with the work logs Matto kept, she saw that Pete, along with another hand, had been assigned to the south pasture that entire week. The bluffs were 5 miles in the opposite direction. Pete Gallagher was the only white man Matto employed. He was a drifter who had shown up a year ago, a decent rider, and a hard worker who kept to himself. He was quiet with shifty eyes that never quite met anyone's gaze. The Lakota men treated him with a polite but distinct coolness. A single discrepancy was likely a mistake, but it nagged at her. She started going back through the previous month's ledgers, her pen flying across the pages. She found more. A bill for expensive grain supplement that was never logged in the barn inventory. A request for double the usual amount of kerosene just before a small haystack mysteriously caught fire one night. Each questionable transaction was linked to Pete Gallagher. He was skimming at the very least. But the timing of the incidents suggested something far worse. The snake wasn't just circling the ranch, it was already inside the house. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She had to be sure. Accusing one of Matto's men without irrefutable proof would shatter the fragile trust she was beginning to build. It could destroy her credibility and make her position untenable. Her chance came 2 nights later. She saw Pete slip away from the bunkhouse after the evening meal, not toward the trading post for a drink, but east toward Kane's property. Throwing a dark shawl over her shoulders, she crept out of the house, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the packed earth. The moon was a slender sliver providing little light. She kept to the shadows, her breath held tight in her chest, following the faint sounds of his horse. He led her to a small hidden coulee about a mile from the ranch border. There, a second figure was waiting, a cigarillo glowing like a firefly in the dark. As Josephine crept closer, hiding behind a cluster of sagebrush, the acrid smell of the smoke reached her. The man turned, and the faint moonlight caught the familiar heavy-set profile of Jedediah Kane. "You're late, Gallagher." Kane's voice rumbled low and dangerous. "Had to wait for them to settle in." Pete whined, his voice thin and reedy. "That Indian, he watches everything. What have you got for me?" "He's moving the rest of the herd to the high pasture tomorrow. Thinks they'll be safer there. The north fence is weak by the old cottonwood. A stampede would send them right over the ravine." Josephine's blood ran cold. A stampede would mean the loss of half of Matto's remaining herd. It would be a catastrophic, potentially bankrupting blow. "Good." Kane grunted a sound of deep satisfaction. "And the woman, his new wife, she stays in the house, scribbling in his books," Pete said with a sneer. "Thinks she's a damn queen. Hasn't got a clue. He don't even sleep with her. The men are saying he still moons over that dead squaw of his." "He'll have plenty to moon over when he's begging for scraps," Kane said, tossing his cigarillo to the ground and grinding it out with his heel. He passed a small, heavy pouch to Pete. The clink of coins was unmistakable. "Start the run just before dawn. Make it look like a wolf scare. And Gallagher," Kane's voice dropped, becoming hard as iron, "if this goes wrong, I don't know you." "It won't go wrong," Pete assured him, his voice thick with greed. Josephine didn't wait to hear more. She backed away slowly, silently, her mind racing. Every muscle in her body screamed at her to run, but she forced herself to move with deliberate care until she was out of earshot. Then she flew, her feet barely touching the ground, the thorny branches of greasewood tearing at her skirt. She burst into the main room of the house, her chest heaving, her hair wild. Matto was there, sitting by the low fire, cleaning a rifle. He looked up, his eyes widening in alarm at her state. "Josephine, what is it?" "It's Pete!" she gasped, leaning against the doorframe to support her trembling legs. "Pete Gallagher. He's working for Kane. I saw them. I heard them." She poured out the whole story, the ledgers, the discrepancies, the meeting in the coulee. She told him about the planned stampede at dawn, her words tumbling over one another in her haste. Matto listened, his expression hardening into a mask of cold fury. He didn't question her, didn't doubt her for a second. The evidence she had gathered, the risk she had taken, it was all there in her terrified, determined eyes. He stood up the rifle, looking like a toy in his hands. "Where?" he asked, his voice a low growl. "The north fence by the old cottonwood. They plan to send the herd into the ravine." He gave a sharp nod. He strode to the wall and pulled down a well-worn gun belt, strapping it around his hips. "Setanagi," he bellowed, his voice echoing through the quiet house. His men appeared almost instantly, their faces alert and questioning. He spoke to them in rapid Lakota, his words sharp and commanding. Their eyes widened, then narrowed with a shared, deadly purpose. They disappeared and returned moments later, armed and ready. Matto turned back to Josephine. Her part was over. She expected him to tell her to stay inside, to lock the doors. Instead, he looked at her. Truly looked at her for the first time since she had arrived. He saw not just the white wife or the bookkeeper, but the woman who had just risked her life for his ranch, for his home. "You have a good eye and a strong heart, Josephine," he said, his voice quiet, but filled with a respect that warmed her more than any fire. "Stay here. Bar the door. Don't open it for anyone but me." He and his men melted into the night, leaving Josephine alone in the silent house, the weight of the coming dawn pressing down on her like a physical blow. She had uncovered the snake, but now it was cornered, and she knew a cornered snake was the most dangerous kind. The silence in the aftermath of their departure was more terrifying than any noise. Josephine barred the heavy oak door and paced the main room like a caged animal. Every gust of wind sounded like a footstep. Every creak of the house was a harbinger of violence. She had given Matto the information, but what if their trap failed? What if Cain had more men waiting? She couldn't just wait. It wasn't in her nature. Going to the study, she lit a lamp, her hands shaking so badly it took 3 tries. She pulled out a map of the ranch Matto had drawn. She found the north pasture, the old cottonwood, the ravine. It was a treacherous piece of land, a perfect place for an ambush. Matto and his men were walking into a situation where they would be outnumbered. Her eyes fell upon the rifle Matto had been cleaning. An old heavy Winchester he kept mounted above the fireplace. She had never fired a gun in her life. Her father had considered it unladamy-like, but she had watched Matto and his men practice. She knew how to load it. With a resolve that came from the deepest well of her fear, she took the rifle down. It was heavy, smelling of oil and steel. She found the ammunition in the study desk, and with clumsy fingers managed to load the chamber. She wouldn't be a helpless woman waiting for rescue. This was her home now, bought and paid for with her name. She would defend it. An hour before dawn, the prairie erupted. It started as a low rumble, a vibration she felt through the floorboards, and quickly grew into the thunder of 1,000 panicked hooves. The stampede. It was happening. A knot of ice formed in her stomach. Then came the sharp crack of rifle fire, sporadic at first, then a full-blown fusillade. Muzzle flashes lit up the pre-dawn horizon like angry fireflies. She ran to the window, her knuckles white on the heavy stock of the Winchester, peering into the darkness. She could see nothing but distant, chaotic flashes of light. The sounds of the battle seemed to last an eternity. The thunder of the herd receded, and the gunfire became more sporadic, finally sputtering into an unnerving silence. Who had won? Was Matto alive? Was he hurt? The waiting was the worst torture. The sky began to lighten in the east, painting the clouds in shades of grey and rose. Just as the first rays of sun crested the horizon, she saw them. 3 riders approaching the house. It was Matto Sitan and Nagi. They were leading a 4th horse, upon which a figure was slumped and tied. Pete Gallagher. Relief washed over her so potent it left her weak. She fumbled with the bar on the door and threw it open, the heavy rifle still clutched in her hands. Matto slid from his horse, his face streaked with dirt and gunpowder. He had a bloody gash on his forearm, but he was alive. His eyes found her in the doorway, saw the rifle, and his expression was one of pure astonishment. "The herd is safe," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "We turned them before they reached the ravine. Gallagher won't be a problem anymore." "Poh-ho-ho-ho," Setan and Nagi dismounted, hauling the treacherous ranch hand from his horse and dragging him toward the small, sturdy smokehouse that would serve as a temporary cell. Pete was groaning, a dark bruise swelling on his cheek, where it was clear Matto's fist had connected. Josephine's eyes were locked on the bloody gash on Matto's arm. "You're hurt?" "It's nothing," he grunted, but as he moved toward the porch, he swayed, a wave of dizziness hitting him. She rushed forward, grabbing his good arm to steady him. The contact sent a jolt through both of them. It was the first time they had touched with anything other than cold formality. "Let me see," she insisted, her voice firm. She led him inside and pushed him gently into a chair by the fire. Winyan appeared, her face a mask of concern, but Josephine, acting on pure instinct, said, "I'll handle this." She fetched the medical supplies, carbolic acid, clean linen bandages, and hot water. Her hands, which had trembled loading the rifle, were now steady as she cleaned the wound. It was a deep graze, torn open by a bullet. He winced as she disinfected it, hissing through his teeth, but he didn't pull away. He watched her, his dark eyes intense, reading her face in the flickering firelight. "You had the Winchester," he said, his voice quiet. "I wasn't going to wait here uselessly," she replied, her fingers working deftly as she wrapped the bandage. "This is my home too." The words hung in the air between them. My home. In that moment, it was true. It had ceased to be a simple sanctuary, and had become something she would fight for, bleed for. When she finished, she tied off the bandage, and finally looked up, meeting his gaze. The walls between them, the carefully constructed barriers of their business arrangement, had been burned away in the fire of the night's battle. He wasn't just her husband in name. He was her partner, her ally, and she, in his eyes, was no longer just a legal shield, but a woman of unexpected courage. He reached out his uninjured hand and gently touched her cheek, his calloused thumb tracing the line of her jaw. His touch was not one of passion, but of something deeper, more profound: gratitude, respect, and a dawning awe. "Josephine," he said, and her name on his lips sounded different, now imbued with a new meaning. "Thank you." The quiet intimacy of the moment was broken by a shout from outside. Setan stood in the doorway, his face grim. "Mato, we found this on Gallagher." He held up a blood-stained piece of paper. "It's a signed confession. He admits Cain paid him for the rustling the well. But there's more. He says Cain was the one who spooked Anpetu's horse. He says it was no accident. Cain meant for her to die." The truth, stark and terrible, filled the room, sucking all the air from it. Mato's face went pale beneath his tan, his expression crumbling into one of pure, raw agony. The wound on his arm was nothing compared to the one that had just been torn open in his soul. He looked from the confession in Setan's hand to Josephine's horrified face, and she saw a man pushed to the very edge of his endurance. Jedediah Cain hadn't just been trying to take his land. He was a murderer who had gotten away with it. And now the war was no longer about property. It was about justice. A justice the law might never provide. The confession changed everything. It was no longer a war of attrition. It was a blood feud. Mato dispatched Nagi to ride for Sheriff Pike in Deadwood, carrying Pete Gallagher's signed statement. But Deadwood was a day's ride away, and everyone in the room knew Jedediah Cain would not wait patiently for the law to come for him. A cornered animal is at its most vicious, and Cain was now cornered. Mato was a different man. The stoic calm was replaced by a coiled, lethal intensity. The grief he had buried for over a year was now a whetstone, sharpening his rage to a razor's edge. He was preparing for a siege. He, Setan, and the other Lakota hands, a force of only 5 men, began barricading the windows and creating firing positions in the barn and the main house. Josephine refused to be relegated to the sidelines. "What can I do?" she demanded, following Mato as he checked their stores of ammunition. He paused and looked at her, his eyes dark with the storm inside him. "Load every rifle and stay away from the windows." She didn't argue. She found her place at the long dining table and began the grim, methodical work of filling cartridges. Her hands moved with a newfound purpose. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her belly, but it was overlaid with a fierce, protective anger. Cain had taken Mato's first wife. She would not let him take anything else. Thomas, pale and frightened, was hidden with Winion in the root cellar, the safest place on the ranch. The attack came in the late afternoon. Cain didn't come alone. He had brought 12 men, hired guns and ranch hands, loyal to his money, a small army against their handful of defenders. They rode in, not as a posse, but as a marauding band spreading out to surround the ranch buildings. "Mato Ohan!" Kane's voice boomed across the yard. "You've got something that belongs to me, that lying coward, Gallagher. Send him out and we can end this. Gallagher stays here until the sheriff arrives. Kane." Mato yelled back from a window in the main house. "He's going to tell them everything, about the cattle, the water, and about Anpetu." There was a moment of charged silence. Then Kane's enraged roar echoed across the prairie. "Open fire!" The world exploded in a cacophony of gunfire. Bullets splintered the wood of the house, shattering the few remaining panes of glass. Josephine dropped to the floor, her heart pounding. From the barn and the house, Mato and his men returned fire, their shots measured and precise, a stark contrast to the wild, undisciplined volley from Kane's men. The siege was a nightmare of noise, smoke, and the smell of gunpowder. Hours crawled by. Josephine kept the rifles loaded, her hands raw and aching. Twice Kane's men tried to charge the house, and twice they were beaten back by the deadly accuracy of the defenders. Satan was hit in the shoulder, but Winyan, emerging from the cellar, patched him up with a grim determination, and he was back at his post within minutes. As dusk began to settle, Kane grew desperate. Under the cover of failing light, he and two of his men made a dash for the house, using a water trough for cover. They were trying to set it ablaze. "Josephine, the back window!" Mato yelled. She scrambled to the small window at the back of the house, the Winchester heavy in her hands. She could see them, 3 figures crouched by the corner, one holding a torch. Her hands trembled. These were not targets. They were men. But they were threatening to burn her home down around her, to kill the people who had become her family. She rested the barrel on the sill, took a breath, and remembered how Mato had stood calm and centered. She aimed not at a man, but at the torch. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked back hard against her shoulder, the noise deafening in the small room. The torch exploded in a shower of sparks and fell to the ground. One of Kane's men yelped, grabbing his hand. The element of surprise was gone. From the barn, a shot rang out, and another of the men fell. Kane, cursing, dragged his wounded man back into the darkness. The fighting subsided into a tense standoff as darkness fell completely. They were trapped. Ammunition was running low. It was only a matter of time. Suddenly from the east a new sound emerged, the thunder of many horses riding hard. For a heart-stopping moment, Josephine thought Kane had brought reinforcements. But then a voice cut through the night, clear and authoritative. "In the name of the law, cease fire. This is Sheriff Pike. Lay down your weapons." Relief so powerful and absolute it was dizzying flooded the besieged ranch. Sheriff Pike had arrived, and he hadn't come alone. He had a posse of 10 deputies with him. Nage had made it through. Trapped between the ranch defenders and the law, Kane's men threw down their guns in surrender. But Kane was not among them. Mato saw him first, a single figure breaking from the darkness, running not toward the law, but towards the creek, Red Bear Creek, where Anpetu had died. With a guttural cry, Mato vaulted through the shattered window and gave chase. This was not for the sheriff. This was for him. Josephine watched in horror, then, without thinking, ran after him. She found them on the bank of the creek, 2 silhouettes against the moonlight. Kane had a knife. Mato had only his hands. They circled each other, panting like wolves. "You took her from me." Kane screamed, his voice raw with madness and hate. "She should have been mine. You defiled her name." Mato snarled, his voice a low growl of pure agony. "You took the sun from my sky." Kane lunged. The fight was brutal and primal. They crashed into the shallow water fists and fury. Josephine screamed. A gunshot rang out, Sheriff Pike firing into the air. When the lawmen pulled them apart, Kane was a blubbering, broken mess. Matto stood dripping and bruised, his chest heaving. His eyes found Josephine's across the creek bed. In their depths, she saw the storm finally break. The rage was gone, replaced by a vast, aching emptiness, but also for the first time, a glimmer of peace. Justice in its own raw way had been served. The dust settled. Kane and his men were led away in chains. The sun rose on a battered but unbroken Ohan ranch. As the dawn light spilled across the valley, Matto stood beside Josephine on the porch, looking out at the land that was still theirs. The bandage on his arm was dirty, her dress was torn, and the house behind them was scarred with bullet holes. "The contract we made," he said, his voice quiet. "It's fulfilled. The ranch is secure. You are free to go as we agreed. I'll give you the money and safe passage." Josephine looked at him, at his proud, wounded face. She looked at the house, at the endless prairie sky. She thought of St. Louis, of the life she had fled. It was a ghost, a dream. This, the dust, the danger, the quiet strength of the man beside her. This was real. "A contract can be renegotiated," she said softly. "Perhaps this one is no longer about a white wife or a legal shield." He turned to her, a question in his weary eyes. "Perhaps," she continued, a small, genuine smile touching her lips for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. "It could be about a partner, about building something new right here. Together." Matto looked at her, at the woman who had faced down his enemies, who had defended his home, who had seen the broken man behind the warrior and had not fled. He reached out and took her hand, not as a seal on a deal, but as an anchor in a stormy world. His grip was warm and strong, and for the first time it felt like coming home. And so, a marriage born from a desperate bargain at sunset became a union forged in the fires of conflict and sealed by mutual respect. Josephine Bellwether, the disgraced socialite, found her true strength not in a ballroom, but in the heart of the unforgiving Dakota territory. And Matto Ohan, the grieving Lakota warrior, found that a new day could dawn even after the most profound darkness. Their story is a powerful reminder that sometimes the most unlikely arrangements can lead to the truest partnerships, and that a home is not just a place you own, but something you build and fight for side by side. The Wild West was a land of brutal endings, but for them, it was the beginning of everything. If their story of resilience and unexpected love moved you, please give this video a thumbs up and share it with someone who loves a true tale from the Old West. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next journey into the dramatic, untold stories of history.